Hello, and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 566, The Revolutionary, Part 1. All this talk of outlaws and lawbreaking over the last few weeks has gotten me thinking, my friends. There's been an episode I've had rattling around as an idea for a while now, and I think, fresh on the heels of our most recent string of lawbreaking, now is finally the time for it. You see, in history today, biography as a discipline is considered somewhat outmoded. If you're at all plugged into the academic world, you know that biographies of famous historical figures are simply not a thing in the way they were in the past. That approach to writing history, a focus on the so-called great man, is considered to be behind the times, ignorant of the forces that in the academic consensus really drive history, the big social, impersonal, and economic ones. And I have to admit that on a purely intellectual level, I agree with that trend. Great man approaches to history are not, in my view, great for the discipline as a whole. They tend to put undue emphasis on the actions of the rich and powerful, and can obscure as much as they reveal about the forces that drive social change. But at the same time, and maybe this is why I didn't make a great academic historian, I have my reservations about this shift. For one thing, I do think there are cases where it's hard to escape a great man view of history. The classic example I point to with my students is the Napoleonic Wars. It's hard to imagine, if you replayed the history of France after the French Revolution, that without someone as charismatic and militarily capable as Napoleon at the helm, things would have turned out identically. In the case of Japanese history, look at someone like Tokugawa Ieyasu. Sure, the reunification of Japan after the civil wars of the 1500s, probably inevitable. But if someone else had done it, someone not as detail-minded or interested in stability on a structural level as Tokugawa Ieyasu, it's hard to imagine the next few centuries playing out the same way. Maybe instead you get a government that's far more structurally unstable, like the previous two shogunates, and maybe you get even more civil war. Who knows where things could have gone from there. So I'm a bit hesitant to say for sure that the right or wrong person at the right or wrong place can't change the course of history, that it's all structure all the way down. And besides, one thing that worries me about historical academia is that historians as a field have become really bad at talking to non-historians. Some of that, of course, is a question of media literacy, and this is where, as a teacher, I insert my whole rant about kids these days with your TikToks and your smartphones, and how back in my day, we made do when we were ignoring our teachers by programming Doom into our graphing calculators the way God intended. But it's also an issue of historians being so deep in the weeds on various aspects of theory that our work can be incomprehensible. It's so impersonal, so focused on thematic discussion of ideas from philosophy or critical theory, that there's no narrative through line, nothing that an interested non-expert could grab onto and follow. And if nothing else, biography is a clear narrative. It gives you a story to follow through on. So as you can tell, I've been thinking about this for a while now, and I've been kicking around the idea of a modernized biography, a way to explore someone's historical context and questions that it raises through the story of their life. So for the next few weeks, we're going to try our hands at this, and given our recent focus on the outlaw side of life in Japan, I think I know just the person to do it with. Our subject is going to be someone you probably haven't heard of before. His name is Miyazaki Manabu, and he's come up exactly once in the entire 550-plus episode run of the podcast, so not an unknown, but not exactly someone you're likely to have heard of, unless you were really deep in the paint on post-war Japanese history. An absolutely fascinating life, and I'm not the only one who thinks so. He wrote a few books towards the end of his life, but the most famous one is his biography called Toppamono. It's a hard title to translate. Toppa is something like breakthrough or break past, so Toppamono is one who breaks through, more or less. That biography sold 600,000 copies in Japan in the first few years after it was published in 1995. It's been reissued a few times since and translated into a few languages to boot, including English. And that's probably because Miyazaki's life was a wild ride. He was a little bit of everything, taking on so many roles over the course of a life that lines up pretty perfectly with the trajectory of post-war Japan. So, let's talk about it. And by the way, I'm just going to say this now. Long term listeners know I'm hilariously bad at guessing how long series will take, so I'm not even going to try to estimate in this case. So, when I say Miyazaki's life lines up pretty perfectly with the post war history of Japan, I'm not kidding. He was born on October 25th, 1945, which is exactly 7 weeks and 1 day since representatives of the Japanese government had boarded the American warship Missouri in Tokyo Bay and signed the documents announcing their surrender and ending the Second World War. Miyazaki was the fourth of 4 children born to his family living in the Fushimi ward of Kyoto Prefecture, the little slice of urban sprawl just south of Kyoto proper that covers the plains and rivers which connect the ancient capital to Osaka and the sea. His dad was quite a character in his own right. Miyazaki Kiyochika, who was then 43, was, you see, a yakuza boss. The yakuza are, of course, Japan's organized crime families. We've talked about them before, but for a quick refresh, their origins are murky, lying in the Tokugawa period and the final centuries of Japanese feudalism. There are various romantic legends about the yakuza forming from bands of masterless samurai after the Civil War. More likely, they were just street gangs looking for legitimacy. But they really come into their own after the collapse of the Tokugawa regime, because in many cases their leadership formed ties with the elite of the new Meiji system in order to help control dissent. Famously, for example, yakuza families were involved in suppressing anti-government parties through violence in the first few elections in Japanese history in the 1890s. And as a general rule even today, the yakuza tend to be associated with the hyper-patriotic and ultra-nationalistic Japanese right. Miyazaki Kiyochika's gang was not that influential, and in general the yakuza were in a weak position after World War II because the wartime fascist government had turned on them and thrown many of their leaders in jail. Miyazaki had escaped that fate likely because his gang, the Teramuragumi, was small and only had 30 to 40 members, a gambling ring mostly that, like every other yakuza group, also dabbled in construction. It operated under the protection of a larger syndicate, the Nakajima-kai in Osaka, which is the forerunner of one of the big yakuza families today, the Aizu Kotetsukai. Most of the Teramuragumi membership came from Kyoto's marginalized communities, either Zainichi Koreans, ethnic Koreans who couldn't get Japanese citizenship, or, in many cases, Burakumin, members of what was once upon a time the lowest social class of Tokugawa society, who are still targets of informal discrimination today. Miyazaki would later recall that Teramuragumi remained a small concern for most of his childhood. Neither his father nor most of his father's underlings ever made it far enough in the business to be able to live off the proceeds of their illegal activities entirely, and so construction in particular remained a major source of income for the Teramuragumi. And I have to say, I find Miyazaki's account of his dad absolutely fascinating. On the one hand, there is no pretense in Miyazaki's recollections about who his father was or what he did for a living. He is upfront that his dad was a criminal who constantly violated the law, and there's not a lot of romanticization of Yakuza life. There's not a lot of talk of honor or a code by which you live your life, or any mention of the Gokudo, the extreme way of chivalry, a phrase that's bandied about in a lot of Yakuza movies today, for example, where organized crime is treated almost like this romantic, glorious knighthood. Miyazaki's pretty upfront that his dad was a rough and tumble guy who, so far as he knows, never even learned how to read. He makes a point of saying that most of the Teramuragumi's income didn't even come from gambling dens, it came from something called kobochiya. That's a euphemistic term for recycling, but in the immediate post-war era, it really just meant combing through bombed-out buildings to loot anything that was still useful before the rubble was cleared. Even the most basic finds, like pieces of scrap metal, could be extremely valuable. One of the more famous scandals of post-war Japan, called the Gerard Incident, was based around exactly that when an American soldier named William Gerard shot a Japanese woman, Sakai Naka, after she snuck onto an army shooting range looking for shell casings to sell. Miyazaki the Elder got jobs recycling everywhere from Tokyo to far-off Kyushu, and apparently got into some violent scraps with the local Yakuza as a result, who saw his jobs as an invasion of their territory. This was, by all accounts, a particularly vicious decade in the history of Japanese organized crime, as the destruction of many of the big syndicates during the war, combined with the absolute devastation of defeat, meant the ranks of organized crime swelled like never before. And many of those syndicates had complicated relationships, to say the least. Some gangs were ex-military, others were more traditional gurentai, street gangs. Some were what Miyazaki calls third nationals, ethnic Chinese or Koreans living in Japan, who, when the empire went away, lost Japanese citizenship, but didn't have the money to get back home, and at any rate, many of them had lived in Japan for years, and didn't think of anywhere else as home at all. These gangs would fight each other and the police constantly, and in some cases, Miyazaki's family would ally with the police against other gangs. Anyway, none of this is portrayed glamorously in Toppamono, but you might be noticing there is still an element of romanticism here. The rough and tumble man of the post-war, ready to do what was hard and necessary to support his family, even at a cost to himself. In a certain sense, it's more accurate to the self-image of the yakuza than the slick-backed, wealthy gangster look that you see more commonly in movies. Still, it's not all romanticized. He talks again about his father's illiteracy, about him being a mess with money, having lots of affairs. As for his mother, Miyazaki Fumiko, there's a similarly interesting, but very different portrayal there. She is portrayed as the archetype of a ryosai kenbo, good wife and wise mother, fully devoted to supporting her son and husband. She was the manager of the family's construction business and fully aware of the illegal things they did, as her own father had been involved in organized crime growing up. She managed the finances of the business, including its less legitimate side, and in particular, was central to the process of dango, bid rigging, an important part of the post-war construction industry. Essentially, construction jobs in Japan, like most other places, are supposed to be open bid. Anyone can make an offer to do the job, lowest offer wins. The practice is supposed to help public funds be used efficiently. But during the post-war era, those bidding processes were heavily rigged, with the outcome decided in advance to spread around government funding between competing companies. In particular, the agreed-upon winner was supposed to give kickbacks, a percentage, to all the other competitors, in order to ensure that everyone remained afloat, and that could get pretty pricey. And given that her husband wasn't just running a gambling establishment, but partaking in the gambling, and also not very good at it, Miyazaki Fumiko was the one actually managing that money and handing out the bribes, in addition to the more mundane work of cooking and cleaning on job sites. Collectively, the Miyazakis are portrayed almost like an everyman family of the post-war, scraping by as best they can in a new order. Their involvement with organized crime is treated by their son in this almost matter-of-fact, incidental way, which is maybe a good descriptor of how organized crime was described in the immediate post-war in general. It was just a fact of life. But what about Miyazaki Manabu himself, you might be wondering? How does the boy fit into this narrative? Well, early on, he's not very present. Much of the first chapter is focused on his descriptions of his parents or their neighborhood in Fushimi south of Kyoto, which he describes using the words of the pre-war novelist Sakaguchi Ando as, quote, the garbage pit of Kyoto, a land of hostess bars, derelicts, and the down on their luck hoping for divine intervention at the nearby Fushimi Inari Shrine. There are bits of the young boy's memories in there too, his descriptions of their home, for example, a compound built in the traditional style to cover 300 tsubo, which is about 10,000 square feet or 900 square meters, giving a bit of a lie to the claim they were just scraping by. Of course, that space wasn't just for the three of them. There were also about, quote, 20 young gangsters and navvies, 3 or 4 maids, and 3 men servants, in addition to my immediate family. It was a communal lifestyle akin to a primitive form of communism. And by the way, if you've heard of Miyazaki before, you probably recognize the irony in that sentence. If not, don't worry, we'll get to it. Of course, Miyazaki Manabu had siblings as well, an older brother, Miyazaki Tsuneo, who was 15 when he was born, and thus not a huge presence in his younger brother's life, and 2 sisters. But none of them factored much into his early life. His sisters were largely a non-presence in his memoir, and he doesn't even really name them. Maybe that was a charitable choice because they lived pretty normal lives and were still living them when the book came out, and maybe it was an attempt to protect their privacy. His brother, meanwhile, is named, spoilers, he will be involved in organized crime himself, but also is 15 years older and was already living away from home by the time Miyazaki the Younger was born. Instead, the closest thing he had to siblings were, by his own recollections, his father's henchmen. And that wasn't really the greatest thing. He tells a story about how, after he started elementary school, one of those henchmen offered him a present to celebrate. Miyazaki, of course, being a little kid, asks for something silly, a sword and a gun, and lo and behold, the next day he is handed a Type 38 Imperial Japanese Army rifle, which had been looted from a supply depot, a favorite target of the post-war yakuza. No sword, though. That was, and this is what the henchman actually said, too dangerous. And to be fair, a gun with no bullets is just a badly made club, so I guess it's good to be responsible. Of course, Miyazaki was then promptly arrested by the cops on his way to show his friends his new gun, but he was able to talk his way out of it by claiming that it was just a very accurate toy, and the henchman got off with a light chewing out, so all's well that ends well, I guess. Much of Miyazaki's childhood recollections have to do with his interactions with adults. His parents, their underlings, the caretakers and guardians who took him to and from school, the fancy members of Kyoto's social elite, kabuki actors, even movie actors, film producers, wealthy merchant families, all hoping for the goodwill of Fushimi's Yakuza boss and coming to wine and dine and supplicate. The biggest name he names directly, if you're wondering, is Nagata Masaichi, the president of Daiei Motion Pictures, probably best known for being a guy who took a flyer on a young up-and-coming director by the name of Kurosawa Akira and producing a film of his by the name of Rashomon. Later on, Nagata would become an owner of one of Nippon professional baseball's biggest teams, the Daiei Stars, though they've since gone through a few reincarnations and are now the Chiba Lotte Marines. He was also, of course, a big donor to the Liberal Democratic Party, the governing Conservative Party, and especially to the small but influential faction of Kono Ichiro. Eventually, of course, this family life would start to implode. Miyazaki's father would take another mistress and move out permanently to live with her, and his mother's health and mental stability would start to spiral as a result. Gradually, his parents start to fall into the background of his recollections, even as he's still living with them, but I think it's fair to say that in normal circumstances, Miyazaki Manabu's life would have followed a pretty predictable trajectory. He was the second son of a Yakuza boss during a period of substantial revival in the fortunes of the Yakuza. No one could really know it in the 50s, but the next few decades would be something of a bonanza for organized crime in Japan. Given those circumstances, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that Miyazaki probably felt he was destined to take over some part of the family concern. He wasn't the eldest son, so he might not become the boss, but he would at least be someone of influence within the Teramura Gumi. Except that's not the path Miyazaki ended up following, and the divergence began with his next-door neighbors, the Amagase family. Amagase the Elder was a former commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy who had 3 sons, all of whom were a bit older than Miyazaki, all of whom had attended the pre-war military schools intended to fast-track young boys into a career in the officer corps. For the second son in particular, whom Miyazaki does not give a proper name for, this apparently had the exact opposite effect. Growing up in a military environment and then seeing firsthand the cost of the failed adventurism of the Japanese military radicalized the young boy in the opposite direction, and he ended up joining something called the Sanson Kosakutai, roughly the Mountain and Village Mobilization Corps. Now, I'd be shocked if any of you have heard of these guys before, but they play a very fascinating part in the history of post-war Japan. You might remember that in our overviews of post-war history, we talked about the radicalization of the post-World War II Japanese Communist Party, which saw a surge in membership after the war ended and the American occupation legalized it. It was then radicalized by the reverse course when US occupation authorities began to suppress the party in the name of turning Japan into a stable Cold War ally, and was radicalized even further when the nearby Republic of China was overthrown by Mao's communists. And as a result, starting in the early 1950s, some wings of the Communist Party began to take up the banner of active revolution against the state, including the Sanson Kosakutai. Now, if you have been to Japan any time in, the last 80 years, You've probably noticed this little attempt at overthrowing the system and installing a Maoist dictatorship did not work, because it turned out the radicals had badly misread the situation. Japan was not China. It was not on the verge of revolution. In fact, all the communists really managed to accomplish was burning down some police boxes with Molotov cocktails and pissing everyone else off. This abortive revolution at a time when most people were just trying to scrape by really did not build much sympathy for the Communist Party, and by July of 1955, just before Miyazaki Manabu turned 10, the Japanese Communist Party itself had officially renounced the violent adventurism of its radicals and committed itself to organizing as a traditional political party. Even so, for the next 10 years or so, it would have a pretty rough time at the polls because of this little interlude. So the second Amagase-san was a member of these communist radicals who was presumably wanted by the police for his involvement. Miyazaki himself was, of course, a kid when this was happening, and notes that he didn't really understand it at the time, but apparently his father, funnily enough, had a soft spot for outspoken young communists. That might seem odd, and in fact his father was also the sworn brother of some members of the extreme right, but keep in mind the Teramuragumi did recruit heavily from the lowest of Japan's social classes, especially the Burakumin. Many Burakumin were also involved in the communist movement because of the extreme poverty their communities lived in. Maybe that's where the sympathy came from. Miyazaki Tsutomu, as a result, appears to have stepped in to defend this young kid from the cops by offering a job and offering to make sure the kid didn't break the rules anymore, enough to get the police to back off. At the time, Miyazaki Manabu himself was a terrible student by his own admission, more interested in cutting class with his friends than anything else. And so, Amagase was hired as a tutor to get him back on track. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement for all involved, but I can't imagine Miyazaki Kiyochika really understood quite where an association with this young radical could take his impressionable young son. As it turned out, Amagase was a great teacher. Miyazaki Manabu tells a very endearing story about him that's practically straight out of an inspirational movie about teaching, where instead of teaching physics out of a textbook, he just took the kid to a park and demonstrated centripetal force by spinning around the bar of a swing set. Basically, all of his lessons were like that in some respect. He taught electricity and radio waves using old radios that he'd made use of as part of the Sanson Kosaktai. He taught history and literature by taking his charge around Kyoto to famous sites from the tale of Genji or the Heike Monogatari and quoting the texts offhand. Honestly, he sounds like a really great teacher to me, just the kind of person an impressionable young boy might start to idolize. Amagase did not, according to his students' later recollections, start propagandizing the kid. He worked in a few mentions of his political views, but more out of sincerity than anything else. Miyazaki recalled one of those discussions later when his tutor espoused what he called a populist view of history. Quote, "You know, Manabu-chan, our country's history hasn't been shaped only by the likes of the emperor, Minamoto Yoshitsune, or Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who built Fushimi Castle down the road from us. The truth is that ordinary people, just like the ones you see around here, played their part too, though you won't find their names written down anywhere." And so as Miyazaki entered his teenage years, he embodied this fascinating and divided contradiction. On the one hand was the influence of his tutor, almost an archetypal post-war youth, obsessed with freedom, popular power, disillusioned with the old pre-war Japan and its notions of status, hierarchy, tradition, focused on the egalitarian future. But Miyazaki was still the child of the yakuza as well, and as he got older, he got more involved in the family business too, working on salvage sites, observing the hierarchical way in which they lived. He later recalled one particularly complicated way in which that honor-bound culture would manifest itself in his early life. Quote, "I found myself in an awkward position when it came to fights. I could never afford to run away or otherwise act in a cowardly manner. If a rumor circulated I had fled or backed down from a confrontation, it would have shamed the Teramuragumi. Yet I couldn't get mixed up in a serious brawl and get badly injured either, because my father's henchmen wouldn't let that go unchallenged. The times I did suffer some serious damage, there was always a yakuza involved. The henchmen would be furious. Your head's split open. Who the hell did that? They're not getting away with it." It was obviously an issue where the face or honor of the Teramuragumi and its members was at stake. No matter how hard I tried telling them, it had nothing to do with gang business, and to keep out of it, they wouldn't listen. In one instance, Miyazaki stepped up to stop a group of third-year middle schoolers, the equivalent of ninth graders in the US, from bullying a classmate, like him, a second year, so an eighth grader. Afterwards, those ninth grade students ganged up on Miyazaki and his friends after school and jumped them with boken, wooden martial arts practice swords. The resulting scuffle saw someone draw a knife, and when Miyazaki came home and his parents saw how he looked, the whole thing blew up, especially when it was then revealed that one of the kids on the opposing side was also the child of a yakuza. Not the sort of thing you think about a lot, but you can see how a schoolyard fight could end up triggering a gang war. Fortunately, in this case, cooler heads prevailed. But they didn't always. In one case, Miyazaki actually did provoke a gang war along with his cousin, named Yu. One night, the two of them went to visit a bathhouse in the territory of a smaller neighboring syndicate, the Shinoharakai. The son of the Shinoharakai leader started to pick on Yu, not realizing who he was, and then Miyazaki broke a bucket over his head. In the aftermath, a 2 or 3 day long gang war between the Shinoharakai and the Teramuragumi broke out. Miyazaki later recalled his father praising him, and then gathering his followers around fires in the courtyard, drinking sake, grabbing swords, and digging up some old shotguns and dynamite to go fight the good fight. He didn't think his father was actually proud of him for standing up for his cousin, though. It was just that the Teramuragumi was stronger than the Shinoharakai, and now they had an excuse to take some land and territory, which is what they did. It's hard to imagine what it'd be like to live in a household like that, but this was just daily life for young Miyazaki Manabu. As he later recalled, quote, "My family operated according to an exceedingly simple logic. Every member of the family, women and children included, had a role, and in that capacity was expected to go out and get work by whatever means necessary. The money this brought in was distributed among the rest of the family. In effect, the family acted entirely out of self-interest and looked after its own. As a result, relations between us positively crackled with intensity. We shared our burdens too and bore them together. It was the logic of the poor." The contradictions would only grow as he aged, which in turn meant two things. First, as he got older, he was expected to take on more and more responsibilities within the Teramuragumi. After all, he was the son of the leader, the Oyabun. Second, his schooling, and tutoring with Amagase, got more intense. Amagase in particular was very interested in helping his young protege understand the social and political circumstances of post-war Japan, and was more forthright as his charge got older about his own views. And when his young mentee was a third year in middle school, so again the equivalent of a ninth grader in the US, Amagase took him to something that would change his life. This was the late spring of 1960, and of course that probably gives away what the two of them were doing. You see, that was the time of the contentious battles over the renewal of the US-Japan Mutual Security Treaty, when tensions around the right-wing government of the LDP Prime Minister Kishi Nobusuke crystallized around Kishi's renegotiation of one of the cornerstones of post-war Japan, the security treaty that gave America the right to use Japanese bases for the Cold War. By pretty much every measure, actually, the renegotiated treaty was an improvement on the old one in terms of respect for Japanese sovereignty and rights. The original security treaty didn't even let Japan leave it for any reason. But the fact that Kishi engaged in some pretty flagrant disregards of the democratic norms of the ratification process to get the treaty approved in Parliament in the Diet, plus the fact that the treaty did, for better or worse, align Japan on the American side of what was looking like in the 50s and 60s it could be a nuclear war, made it controversial, to say the least. There is, of course, much we could say about the treaty and its aftermath, but for us, the upshot is that the treaty and Kishi's handling of it provoked a massive backlash from much of Japan's populace and protests in most of the major cities. Those protests, in turn, were successful in ousting Kishi from the prime ministership, but not at stopping the treaty altogether. Amagase took his young student to one of these protests at Kyoto's Maruyama Park, and here's how he remembered it. Quote, "It was practically bursting. There must have been more than 100,000 demonstrators. Newspapers estimated the next day that a total of 5.6 million people across the nation had taken part in the anti-security treaty rallies. The mood in the park was intense. Men and women wearing headbands strode up to the rostrum one after another. They would be greeted with vociferous cheers and applause each time they made a statement like, 50 of us from the Kyoto branch of the Japanese Postal Workers Union are going to Tokyo to carry on the struggle in front of the Diet, the parliament. The sound reverberated through the air like rumbling in the mountains. I had never known such excitement and emotion. I couldn't stop trembling. Something's going to happen, I thought to myself. This feeling translated into near conviction as the protesters started to move. Small groups of demonstrators appeared suddenly out of narrow side alleys to merge with the main body of marchers. It looked like people were appearing from nowhere, and they kept coming for some time. Something was definitely afoot. He recalled with particular shock the news from the evening of June 15, 1960, the night of the heaviest demonstrations in the capital of Tokyo, that one of the student protesters, Kanba Michiko, had been killed by the police. After all, as he put it, this wasn't just some yakuza rumble. How could the forces of law and order, the good guys, kill somebody who hadn't really done anything wrong? Of course, the protests didn't stop the security treaty from going forward. They did torpedo Prime Minister Kishi's political career, but the revised treaty was successfully forced through and became a cornerstone of Japanese foreign policy down to this very day. But nonetheless, they had a profound impact on young Miyazaki Manabu. Quote, "For the adults who had participated, this was a crushing blow that condemned them to a long period of frustration and bewilderment, but to me it was nothing like that. I had known virtually nothing about the security treaty to begin with, so I had no reason to be frustrated. On the contrary, I was agog at the new world that had suddenly been revealed. Various things starting to dawn on me, if only vaguely. There were people working seriously to change society. Their numbers were much larger than I had initially thought. It appeared possible to bring about change, and the kinds of people involved in social movements, known collectively as left-wingers, were quite different from those I had grown up with. This realization was as exciting to me as the first time I watched a movie in color." And this is the start of what is, in my opinion, one of the most fascinating parts of Miyazaki's life trajectory: his shift from the son of a yakuza boss to an active member of the left-wing student movement in Japan during its most radical era in the 1960s. We'll explore how that happened next week. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com and support the network at Patreon. Special thanks to new patron Nance for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next week for part 2.